Hi there, everybody. You should be hearing me by now. I'll remove the promo, and then you can hear me better. Hi. I see only a few of you have arrived. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Joanne. Hi, Gina Marie. Hi, Kay. Please share this for me as much as you can so we can get others here. I've done a little sharing myself. Thank you for coming. So we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to get right to it. As you can see, I want to talk about a number of different things. There were some other reactions I wanted to go over to the debate on Thursday. They were very interesting and very well taken. So let's start with part of a piece from Dave Dayen. The piece is called, part of the unsanitized columns, and it's called Election Edition Debate Night in America. He did this on October 23rd. There's a picture of people watching the debate from a drive-in, at least from parking lots where it was. It's at the Fort Mason Center in San Francisco. And Dave had some notions concerning what happened to Trump at the debate. I'm not going to go over those. I thought that the reflections that Dave had about Joe Biden were very interesting. So he says Joe Biden had an interesting exchange in that immigration section as well. In other words, a section of the debate that dealt with immigration. One that will give any close observer of the Democratic primary some whiplash. Asked about record deportations and family detentions under the Obama administration, Biden forthrightly said, quote, "We made a mistake," unquote. He flew away from Obama's immigration position, the standard historical Democratic line of being tough on the border to show seriousness before seeking a path to citizenship. That wasn't the only move away from Obama, from a candidate that used Obama as a human shield to secure the nomination. Yes, he did. Biden rejected austerity by lauding the ability of the federal government to deficit spend to make up for revenue shortfalls in the state. He talked about, quote, Biden care, unquote, mainly by adding a public option, though the rhetoric he's using is very confused. He appears to be calling the public option a fallback option for states that did not expand the Medicaid program. And also calling for negotiating with pharmaceutical companies over price, which Obama also ran on, but then deep-sixed in a deal with the drug industry. Biden called climate change an existential threat to humanity, quote unquote, and articulated a just transition in association with labor to move away from fossil fuels. The Trump team will try to get a lot of mileage over the final 11 days about Biden closing down the oil industry, which Biden decided to clean up in post-debate remarks. He said he meant phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. But the section where he discussed, quote, fence lines, unquote, was a powerful call for environmental justice for downtrodden communities. Biden mocked the idea that regular people should care about the movement of the stock market. He gave the most significant defense of a $15 an hour minimum wage that has ever been seen in general election presidential politics, completely dismissing, correctly, the idea that it will crush businesses. The minimum wage has been popular wherever it's been put to voters, including deep red states. So this was a no-brainer, says David. And then he says, I have few illusions about who we're getting in Joe Biden if he wins, and the range of possibilities for a Biden administration. But the fact that he felt it necessary to pull away from his predecessor Obama on austerity and deportations, that he felt necessary to go populist on wages, signals where Biden thinks the electorate is at. I think Dave's very right about this, very right. It signals what's going on in Biden's mind. And he ends by saying, and that will be important for his potential future decision-making. And I think it will be too. If we reinforce that with activism and with plenty of demonstrations and protests calling for these things, it will reinforce what Biden already thinks and may well cause him to give us at least some of the things we need, okay, and want. One link that was provided by Dave in this was a link to something by David Sirota, and I'm going to share that with you now because it amplifies what Dave had to say about austerity. Specifically, let me share that screen again. This post on the Daily Poster, which is a Substack blog, where David Sirota is doing most of his original writing these days. And he also has collaborators on the site, too, who are very good. And his title is A BFD. That is a big fucking deal. Biden finally rejects the GOP's austerity talking points. And Dave Sirota says, the two Daves, and I'm laughing. A few months ago, our reporting team spotlighted how Joe Biden's campaign was suggesting that if Trump is defeated, a new Democratic administration may not even try to fulfill its campaign promises because of deficit concerns. When our story went viral, Biden's campaign frantically and rightly backtracked. And Dave Sirota links to a backtrack blog that was posted on the Daily Poster some time ago. And then he says, which was a huge win for accountability journalism. Dave Sirota sees himself as doing accountability journalism. I suppose I see myself as doing accountability live streaming. Anyway, at the final 2020 presidential debate, That success culminated in one of the most important moments in the entire campaign. During a discussion about the budget, Biden brushed off his old deficit hawk buddies, outright rejected GOP talking points, and instead made the point that the federal government must spend what it takes to rescue cities and states. Quote, every single state out there finds themselves in trouble. They're going to start laying off, whether they are red or blue, cops, firefighters, first responders, teachers, because they have to balance their budget, unquote, Biden said. And then, quote again, the founders were smart. They allowed the federal government to deficit spend to compensate for the United States of America. Someone's been talking to Joe Biden. Maybe it was Jared Bernstein, who has been getting spoken to quite a few times since I recall correctly, since 2012 by Stephanie Kelton. Dave goes on. Overall, the debate was demoralizing and depressing, but this moment wasn't. It was a moment that won't get a ton of attention from a media obsessed with frivolity, but it wasn't some small matter. It was everything, says Dave. If a new administration accepts deficit concern trolling and the Beltway's austerity frame, then it is doomed to fail. If a new administration rejects that frame, then the possibility of real change remains alive. It's hard to overstate, says Dave Sirota, how big a shift this is for Biden. He was the guy who spent decades touting his work with Republicans trying to cut programs like Social Security in the name of budget austerity. Now he's expounding on the need for counter-cyclical deficit spending. To use a Bidenism, that's a BFD. Biden's rhetorical change is not only good politics, it is sane policy. With the economy in crisis and with states unable to deficit spend, the federal government must be the demand-side spender of last resort. And it's not like there aren't priorities that require big funding. Investments in jobless benefits, infrastructure projects, and climate change mitigation will boost the economy and are desperately needed for obvious reasons. Biden's declaration will be particularly important in the coming months because we already know that if he wins, Republicans will suddenly start pretending to care about the deficits right after they themselves have been deficit spending at a record pace. If you think that won't happen, see this passage, which is buried in a recent news report at Bloomberg. Quote, a GOP strategist who has been consulting with Senate campaigns said Republicans have been carefully laying the groundwork to restrain a Biden administration on federal spending and the budget deficit by talking up concerns about the price tag for another round of virus relief. The thinking, the strategist said, is that it would be very hard politically to agree on spending trillions more now and then in January suddenly embrace fiscal restraint. This is part, says Dave, of Republicans' predictable playbook. They have no actual principles other than trying to obtain power for themselves and deny it to their opponents. Everyone in the country be damned. The question is whether or not Biden musters the fortitude to stick by his position tonight. It is an open question because over the course of the campaign, he has periodically cited deficit concerns to justify his opposition to major initiatives such as Medicare for All. and opposition that he gratuitously reiterated in one of the debate's many low points. His statement supporting necessary deficit spending at the debate was a complete rejection of that entire deficit hawk rationale. I got to admit, folks, I don't know how I missed that in all the careful notes that I took on the debate, but I did miss it. And shame on me. That was a very, very important observation that was made by Dave Sirota, and a very important indication that Biden at least has on his mind some of the anti-deficit hawkery that is common among many economists today, not just the MMT economists. If he wins, it will be up to congressional Democrats to hold him to his new, better position. They will have to force him to support major investments and oppose the kind of destructive austerity ideology that previously defined Biden's own record and that would crater the economy. I think that blog post was very well taken, and that you ought to read it, and that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. Because maybe something unexpected has happened to Joe Biden. So let's get off the debate, and let's now go to COVID performance. Something new happened in the evaluation of COVID performance. Specifically, there was a report issued by Columbia University specifically the Earth Institute, and within it, the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And the name of the report is 130,000 to 210,000 avoidable COVID-19 deaths and counting in the United States. That's as of when this was written on October 17th. Only a week ago, but there have been many more deaths since then. It'll be interesting for you to see how they got to that. The authors were Erwin Redlener, MD, Jeffrey Sachs, PhD, a well-known economist, Sean Hansen, Master of Public Administration, and also Nathaniel Huppert, who's an MD and a Master of Public Health as well. And this was published on October 21st, but I believe it was written on October 17th. It took a few days to get it out. There's a table of contents there. And guess what they did? They did a comparative analysis of nations, the performance of nations, using the indicator deaths per 100,000 population. Now, I use the indicator deaths per million population, as you know, because we've gone over it here many times, the indicator that's found at the Worldometrics site. So it's the same thing, but simply deaths per million divided by 10. So when they wrote this, the death rate stood at 217,717. It's a good deal higher today. I'll go over that in just a little while. They say the United States currently has the 9th highest mortality rate in deaths per 100,000 globally, with some 66 deaths per 100,000 population. Of course, per million, that's 660 fatalities. It's quite a bit more than that, however, right now, as we'll go into in just a little while. It is behind only Peru, Belgium, also Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, Spain, and Mexico in this statistic. Actually, Mexico is still behind us, but we'll check that out. Okay, in just a minute. I'm pretty sure they're still behind us. Now, they did a nice bar chart on this, and you see that in deaths per 100,000 population, we're at 6633. The Koreans are at 0.85 fatalities per 100,000. When you divide 0.85 or 66.33 by 0.85, you come out with 78. So that means we're doing 78 times worse than South Korea. Now, we know from all the talking I've done here about it that we have only 5 deaths per million, which amounts to 0.5 deaths per 100,000 for New Zealand. So from that, we could infer that the performance of New Zealand, they would have figured at roughly 132 times better than the United States. And of course, neither New Zealand nor Taiwan is on here, because if you look at the bar chart, you wouldn't even be able to see, well, you might be able to see New Zealand, but you wouldn't even be able to see Taiwan because the line would be so thin at 0.3 of a fatality per million and 0.03 hundredths of a fatality per 100,000. So, in order to show a bar graph at all, they had to stop at South Korea. So there's the bar graph. You see that France is quite a bit better than the United States, about 1.5 times better, or 1.4 times better than the United States. And Canada is sort of like 2.5 times better than the United States. And Germany is about 6 times better than the United States. And Australia is something like 20 times better than the United States. And Japan is about 55 times better than the United States. And of course, South Korea is 78 times. But there's also a nice handy-dandy table in this report by Columbia University. And what they've done here is they look at deaths per 100K population. They look at deaths as a percent of the population. Then they look at the proportional deaths, which is to say, the deaths we would have had if we performed as well as South Korea. So if we had performed as well as South Korea, we would have had only 2,800 deaths. Japan, 4,300 deaths. Australia, about 11.7 thousand deaths. Germany, 38.5 thousand deaths. Canada, 85.2 thousand deaths. France, 116.2 thousand deaths. Of course, what we really had in terms of deaths was 217,700, I believe the figure was. So what were the avoidable deaths? There are the avoidable deaths. $215,000 avoidable deaths if South Korea is the benchmark. South Korea's deaths, however, are 27 times, nearly 28 times the deaths suffered by Taiwan. So if we had had if we had had the same number of deaths Taiwan had had in proportion, proportional deaths, our death figure here in the United States would have been 100 fatalities. I love to say that. So they took the same approach, that I did. So I'm viewing this as a validation, of my approach. But they stopped with South Korea and did not go to any nations that had even lower death rates than South Korea had. But it's a nice table. It illustrates the point. And the point is, and they're not afraid to say it, but I do want to point out one other thing before I say, what they say. They point out that the median age of the United States, that while the median age of the United States is just about as low as the median age of Australia, and the two countries have roughly the lowest median age, still, the fatalities per 100,000 in the United States are way, way higher than anywhere else. Even though our median wage is, I don't think it's the lowest. I think Australia has the lowest median wage, which is slightly higher than Australia. And much higher than France's median age, much higher than Canada's, much higher than Germany's, much higher than Japan's, and much higher, somewhat higher than South Korea. I shouldn't say much higher, is it? No, it looks like on this graph, South Korea's median age is actually higher than ours. So they didn't control for median age. But if they had controlled for median age, of course you know that COVID fatalities go lower with age. In other words, they go lower with decreasing age. So if we had controlled for that, the avoidable deaths would have been even higher. they did not mathematically control for that. It's easy to do so. All you have to do is put these two things into a regression equation, and you can easily do that. If they had done that, our performance would have looked even worse compared to other countries. They asked the question, why are U.S. deaths disproportionately high? Insufficient testing capacity. No contact tracing, of course. Or should I say, it is woefully inadequate, to quote this report. And they say these two major deficiencies, inadequate testing and insufficient contact tracing, have blunted the U.S.'s capacity to stop the exponential spread of COVID-19. And of course, we're getting once again into that exponential spread now, as I will cover in just a few minutes. And the next factor about why our deaths were so disproportionately high, a delayed response, delayed interventions and lockdowns in the United States, along with a lack of federal guidance, exacerbated the rapid spread. There's another study from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, which estimated that earlier interventions, including federal guidance from the White House on social distancing, could have prevented as much as 90% of deaths in the U.S. through April 14th, if implemented just 2 weeks earlier than March the 16th. The next factor is lack of a mask, is lack of a mandate to wear the mask, including guidance to wear masks in public. And of course, that has been a big factor. Okay, and again, they cite another analysis from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at Washington, predicts that without clear guidance on mask wearing and social distancing, worst case scenario for the U.S. could eventually lead to, on average, a total of 620,029 American lives lost. We will soon get to where we are today. Other factors, well, politicization, a leadership vacuum, and the failure of top officials to model best practices. And of course, talk about the Trump administration, their failure to accept the recommendations by the CDC. That's the other factor in our poor performance. Of course, they all are factors connected to the poor performance of the administration in the White House and our poor performance as a people, which can also be in large part attributed to lack of leadership from the White House. Then they talk about collateral grief, the wide circle of tragedy with every COVID-19 death. They developed a number for bereavement. Actually, they didn't do it. Researchers at Penn State University created a multiplier, that is a bereavement multiplier, which allowed them to estimate that every U.S. death from COVID-19 will leave approximately 9 bereaved people, assuming an average of some 167,000 avoidable COVID-19 deaths, which is, by the way, charitable, very charitable, means that well over 1.5 million Americans are grieving the death of a loved one that might have been avoided. Long-term impacts and disabilities. Researchers are only beginning to study the long-term health implications of COVID-19, which has been shown to leave long-term damage to patients' lungs, heart, immune system, and brain. An early observational study found that 78 out of 100 recovered COVID-19 patients had abnormal findings on cardiovascular MRI, with 36 also reporting difficulty breathing and unusual fatigue months after their diagnosis. There's an expression beginning to appear to discuss what's being called long COVID. That is, people suffering from COVID without actually dying for quite a long time. Having COVID for 4 weeks, for 12 weeks, and beyond. Having fatigue, having headaches, being basically disabled in terms of an ability to return to work and do what they normally did. A lot of that is coming out of COVID. We don't know exactly how much yet, but we know that it's there. And here's the conclusion. By contrasting the U.S. proportional mortality rate with that of 6 other high-income countries, this report highlights the stark reality that is the U.S.'s continued mismanagement of the pandemic response. Particularly, it is the inability or unwillingness of U.S. officials to adapt or improve the federal response over the course of the pandemic that has strongly contributed to the nation's uniquely high COVID-19 fatality rate. The United States should have and could have done better to protect the nation, and particularly its most vulnerable populations, from a threat that was identified and recognized early in 2020. The weight of this enormous failure ultimately falls to the leadership at the White House and among a number of state governments, which consistently undercut the efforts of top officials at the CDC and HHS. Further, there is little evidence to suggest that science-based policies will prevail going forward with Donald Trump as president, given his continued attacks on science and government scientists. When you're in a pandemic, it's not a time for a decentralized and combative national response. It requires strong leadership and coordination across states towards a common purpose of defeating the threat with the might of the whole nation. The cases of South Korea, Japan, Australia, Canada, Germany, and France demonstrate that the scope of the crisis and suffering did not need to reach the level seen in the United States. And the argument would have been even more convincing if the cases of New Zealand and Taiwan had been included in this comparative analysis. It's particularly striking that if we had managed this in the way Taiwan had managed it, we would now be sitting with 100 fatalities. And by the way, if that had happened, Donald Trump's re-election as president would not now be in question. He has killed hundreds of thousands of us, or his leadership has done that. And it will cost him the presidency of the United States. I left the link, of course, to the report so you can see it. But now, what I want to share with you is the very latest from the Worldometrics site. I often cite from this site, but I rarely share it. So let us share it now. Let's go to the top. That's where we find the normal results. Let's see if this is updated. It's a little light for today. So let's see. Let's get the very latest. What I'm about to get should be the final results for today. Usually they're in by 9:46. Let me look at yesterday's results, which are actually the results for today. There were 784 fatalities, okay, according to that site, okay, the Worldometrics site. That lifted total fatalities in the United States to 230,068 people. And deaths per million, 694 deaths per million, or 69.4 deaths per 100,000. And looking at the rankings here, you have to include San Marino and Andorra because they are microstates with very little population. And very small number of total cases, okay, as a result. Okay, so you see Peru up there at the top, and Belgium. They've been losing a lot of people lately. And when I started to look at them, they were at something like 842. Now they've gone up to 918. Things are not going well for them right now, but they're not increasing as fast as other nations. Like Spain has been gaining on them for some time, and Brazil, look at Brazil, gaining on Spain, moving so fast, it's going to catch Spain very soon. Okay, and Bolivia, 734 fatalities per million. Those poor people, ruled for a year now by right-wing fascists. Probably the most critical year for pandemic fatalities in the history of that particular country. And they became victims of the fascists. What would have happened if the coup had not occurred in Bolivia? I'll tell you what would have happened. The Cuban doctors would have come into Bolivia because Evo would have brought them, okay, immediately. And the pandemic there would have been contained by using the same methods that they have used to contain it in Cuba. That is what would have happened. Most probably, those 734 deaths per million would have gone down to something like, I don't know, maybe 20 deaths per million. A large proportion, very large proportion of the total fatalities in Bolivia, 8,608 people, would have been saved had that coup, partly engineered by the United States and by the Organization of American States, had it never happened. They killed, through their actions and their policies, more than 8,000 of the 8,600 people who died in that company, in that the country, who did not have to die. There's Chile there at 725. They're number 6, discounting the microstates. Ecuador is number 7 at 708. And there's the good old USA at 694. And you'll notice that Mexico is behind us, as I said. They're at 683 deaths per million. And the UK is 658 deaths per million. So those are the top-level nations. Okay, in the ranking, you'll see that South American nations are having a terrible time right now. There's Argentina. It's in back of the UK, 631. But let us leave there the deaths per million and total deaths, while noting again the milestone of 230,000 deaths have been passed, if you believe the Worldometer website. That has been passed in the United States today. That is news. Now let's look at another piece of news. This is the reproduction rate in the United States. I'm sorry, I got to share this with you so you can see it. It's very striking. So you can see it. Okay, the reproduction number tells you whether case numbers are increasing or decreasing. This is called the R sub T number. The higher it is, the higher is the reproduction rate of the virus. So there we are. You see that graph? Only 3 states. There are 51 jurisdictions here, 50 states and DC. There are only 3 jurisdictions that are colored in green. That means their reproduction rate is less than 1. It means the number of cases in those states is going down currently. 3 states are Mississippi, Maine, and Oregon. DC is at 1.00, which means the rate of new cases is staying constant. The reproduction rate is constant. Okay, the rate of growth is constant. Here's New York. It's at 1.02. So 47 out of the 51 jurisdictions, including DC, now have an increasing rate of reproduction of the coronavirus and COVID cases. That's what's happening now. See that graphic? Only 3 states are declining, and 1 is remaining the same. Now I'm going to do something. I'm going to show you what things were like 3 months ago. That was it 3 months ago. In July, the end of July, 3 months ago, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. At that time, there were 14 jurisdictions where COVID was increasing. They had a reproduction rate of more than 1. The lowest being the 1.01 of North Carolina. And the highest being Hawaii's reproduction rate, 1.21. That was only 3 months ago. Compare that chart with the latest chart. Again, rather striking, isn't it? We are in deep shit, people, and it's getting deeper. Well, let me stop with that. And let me go on to 2 last things that I wanted to cover. Because of the debate on October 22nd, something else that happened on October 22nd was kind of ignored. Here's an article from Common Dreams by Heidi Shierholz of the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, if I recall correctly. Article will tell us, though, quickly. She always tells us every Thursday what's happening with jobs. Headline, with millions of people out of work, the Senate's inaction is not only cruel, it's bad economics. And another 1.1 million people applied for unemployment insurance benefits last week. That includes 787 people who applied for regular state unemployment insurance and 345,000 who applied for pandemic unemployment assistance, PUA. The PUA is the federal program for workers who are not eligible for regular unemployment insurance, like gig workers. It provides up to 39 weeks of benefits, but it is set to expire at the end of this year, December 31st. The 1.1 million who applied for UI last week was a decline of 47,000 from the prior week's revised figures. Last week was the 31st straight week. Total initial claims were far greater than the worst week of the Great Recession. If that comparison is restricted to regular state claims, because we didn't have a PUA in the recession, the initial claims last week was still well over 3 times their pre-recession levels. Most states provide 26 weeks of regular benefits, and October marks the 8th month of this crisis. This means many workers were exhausting their regular state UI benefits. In the most recent data, continuing claims for regular state UI benefits dropped by more than 1 million, from 9.40 million to 8.37 million. That's not good news, though. It means that people are out of the regular benefits. Fortunately, after an individual exhausts the regular state benefits, they can move on to Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC, which provides an additional 13 weeks of benefits to people who have exhausted their regular state unemployment insurance. However, in the latest data available for PEUC, the week ending October 3rd, PEUC rose by just 510,000 to 3.3 million, offsetting only 41.8% of the 1.2 million decline in continuing claims for regular state benefits. Department of Labor data suggests that right now, 24.0 million workers are either on unemployment benefits or have applied recently and are waiting to get approved. But importantly, that number is an overestimate. For one thing, initial claims for regular state by UI and PUA should be non-overlapping. That is how the Department of Labor has directed state agencies to report them. But some individuals are erroneously being counted as being in both programs. An even bigger issue is that states are including retroactive payments in their continuing PUA claims, which would also lead to double accounting. All this means nobody knows exactly how many people are receiving unemployment insurance benefits right now, which is another reminder that we need to invest heavily in our UI infrastructure and technology. So there it is. It's broken down in the chart there. Figure B shows continuing claims in all programs over time. The latest data for October 3rd show continuing claims are nearly 22 million above where they were a year ago. However, the above caveat about continuing the PUA claims applies here too, which means the trends over time since March may be distorted. Then she talks about how the $600 plus up has gone, and about how when these programs expire, millions of these workers and their families will be financially devastated. But there's little hope for another stimulus bill before next year. And you know about this because I've been talking about it. There was hope for a deadline on Friday for Nancy Pelosi and the White House to have made a deal. As of now, as of when I went on tonight, as far as I know, there was no deal. They missed their Friday deadline, and they haven't made a deal today. And evidently, Mnuchin has been digging in. When he came back from the Middle East, I thought maybe that was going to facilitate a deal. But he started digging in and ending the compromises that were going on between Mark Meadows, and Nancy Pelosi. I don't know why Mnuchin started acting that way. Trump is off campaigning, and he's probably not considering the politics of this. And maybe he's not there to tell Mnuchin to make a deal. And that, unless they make a deal, it may kill the last chance that Trump has to win, come out on top in this election. So Heidi Shierholz ends with the labor market. Wait a minute, let me find that paragraph. Let me find the beginning of that paragraph. Blocking more stimulus is not just cruel, it's terrible economics. And then she says, not providing stimulus in the form of aid to state and local governments will cost millions of jobs. The labor market is still more than 12 million jobs below where we would be if the recession hadn't happened. And job growth is slowing. Senate Republicans should be embracing, not blocking stimulus. Blocking more stimulus also means no additional housing and nutrition assistance, no COVID-related health and safety measures for workers, no aid to the Postal Service during this critical time, and no additional support for virus testing, tracing, and isolation members or virus treatment and support for hospitals and for other health providers. All of these things would have helped our economy and the people in it recover from the COVID-19 crisis. But blocking stimulus is also exacerbating racial inequality due to the impact of historic and current systemic racism. But Black and Latinx communities have seen more job loss in this recession and have less wealth to fall back on. The lack of stimulus hits these workers the hardest. For the workers in this pandemic aren't just losing their jobs. An estimated 12 million workers and their family members have lost employer-provided health insurance due to COVID-19. Heidi Shierholz leads the Economic Policy Institute's Perkins Project on Worker Rights and Wages, a project named after Frances Perkins, who was FDR's Secretary of Labor, and also the person behind both minimum wage and Social Security. Heidi Shierholz also heads the EPI's efforts to advance a worker-centered policy agenda. Heidi Shierholz probably wants to be the new Secretary of Labor, and she might be considered. It's also being said that Bernie Sanders is campaigning for the post of Secretary of Labor in a Biden cabinet. I don't know why he would do that. It seems to me he can do more for people with the chairmanships he's going to have in the Senate. Anyway, one last thing. It's also by Dave Dayen. I'll share that too. This is unsanitized from October 22nd. Paying restaurants to close is a public health imperative. This says Dave. There's a picture of a restaurant with an outdoor dining area in the parking lot of Coco's Bakery and Restaurant in Montebello, California. And let's get to the meat of this. Dave says, we're fully engaged in the third wave of the coronavirus, with cases and hospitalizations rising to August levels and deaths starting to upswing a bit as well. The optimistic case for the virus sees us about halfway through, with 9 months or so until we can see anything like normal on the horizon. Given that we're in that range, oh, by the way, I agree with this, we can get simpler about the steps that need to be taken from a public health standpoint. A mask mandate is the first, controversial though it may be. The second, picked up by Elizabeth by Elizabeth Rosenthal today, is to pay bars and restaurants to close. Governors and mayors are nervous, especially without the guarantee of federal fiscal relief, to lock down their economies. But that actually matters less than you think. In a raging pandemic, the bulk of people are actually sharp enough to stay inside. Lack of demand, not lockdowns, has crushed sectors that rely on steady streams of people gathering, especially indoors. So whether there are orders to shutter or not, bars and restaurants will struggle to survive financially. We also know these businesses are key vectors for community spread. You can't wear a mask while eating and drinking, and as the weather cools, these unmasked people will be pushed indoors into crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. This look at a college town in Wisconsin, he links to that, shows the general direction. Kids congregating at bars and restaurants, catching the virus. Then it passes to older people, and then those older people die. Maybe it goes through a couple of iterations, from students to parents, or to nursing home employees, and then to residents, but it spreads. That starts at the most basic place where a lot of people are getting together. Maybe death rates have dropped, but not enough to keep vulnerable people safe. Now, it would be easy to say we should just close bars and restaurants until the danger is lifted. This has run into public resistance and statewide bans on local mandates. And for restaurants and bar owners already facing near extinction, an extended shutdown is just impossible. The way to give those owners a chance to keep the community healthy and survive is to just pay them. Pay them what they need to stay closed for in-person dining, with their workers paid until the national emergency ends. The workers will pay taxes on their salaries, so state and local governments won't lose out as much. The recent innovation in to-go meals could be maintained, keeping restaurants a little busy and in competition with one another. The owners won't join in common cause with liberators and anti-maskers then. And if the optimist case is correct, we'll have to do this for months, not for years. As Rosenthal notes, the precedent is farm supports, where we pay farmers not to grow crops for both supply and demand and environmental reasons. If you close just bars and restaurants, you've gone a surprisingly long way to eliminating spread and minimizing the events that allow the virus to run rampant. There's a bill called the Restaurants Act that purports to do that, but there's no requirement in it to maintain payroll. If that can be fixed, and if tipped workers are made whole through it, that's a baseline for something that would be one of the biggest public health interventions you can do right now. Unfortunately, by the time we have a Congress willing to put something like this together, it may be too late. And that, of course, is absolutely true. So that's it for what I wanted to call your attention to in Dave's article, okay, and in the news. We are entering a grave period. Now let's look at your comments. So, Steve says to Kay, Steve Wolfbrand says to me, hi, Doc. Hi, Steve. Kay says, hi, Steve. Steve says, hello, beautiful. Steve says, trying to follow the Dodgers at the same time. And Steve Gonzo says, Yeezy JFK 2020. JFK 2020. Steve says, how could the founders see 200 years into the future? Give me a break. Most of those fuckers owned slaves. Victims of their times, I know, but we're way beyond that. Kay says, I like what I heard, but still skeptical Biden will follow up if elected. Me too. Bernie will push, as will the squad, and others, though, will push too. And by the way, if we can get the movement for a People's Party going, that will push too. Steve says Biden is a liar. Yes, he is. So, what's new, Steve? What's new? Kay says, that is why I'm skeptical, Steve. Steve Gonzo says, but Nina Turner. Hello, somebody. Goldman Sachs. Hello. And Steve Gonzo said, Ohio set new highs 4 days running. Steve Gonzo, DeWine needs to stop listening to his POS GOP State House. Yes. Joanne Ricardo says, I bit the bullet and voted Biden, hoping the progressives will push him left. Well, maybe he'll have a hand in taking himself left also. I mean, not everything stays the same. People don't always behave in the way they have previously behaved, folks. I mean, look at Pope John the 23rd. Nobody expected him to do what he would do when he became the Pope. Even though he only served for 3 years before he died, he did much to revolutionize the Catholic Church in those 3 years. It was fantastic. And nobody had an inkling that he would do that. They elected him as a compromise choice who they thought would be a caretaker pope for a few years. Because they didn't want to appoint, they didn't want to elect the person who was known as the Red Pope, specifically the Milan Cardinal, Giuseppe Cardinal Montini, who later became John the 23rd's successor, Pope Paul VI, the Red Cardinal. They thought Pope Paul was a communist, so they appointed John the 23rd instead. And John the 23rd was certainly the greatest pope in modern times. By far, to date. Kay says, hell, I'm afraid to go anywhere and getting worse now. Kay says, I will too, Joanne, if I get to vote. Joanne says, Kay Clark Ron, I only go to doctors and small convenience stores with masks. Well, we go to some other places too. We still go to Costco, but when I go into Costco, I have double mask. I have a mask on my face, and then I have a face shield too, as well as the mask. Because I'm just aware of how crowded it is. They're trying to social distance. And of course, even though it's indoors, the ceilings are very, very high, and there's lots of air circulation and stuff. But it's just too dangerous, okay, too crowded. Okay. And we also go into Trader Joe's, which here is not as crowded, and they're making every effort to social distance there. So they've been pretty careful over there. I don't think they've had any COVID, okay, among their staff. We always see the same staff there. Every time we go, we see the same people. Yeah, geez, going out to Trader Joe's is a social event for us. Steve Gonzo says, also DeWine third add to their tyranny execution list. Kay says, I go to a grocery store and drugstore and that's it. Steve Gonzo says, I load up once a month with groceries, so that's good, Steve. You're being very careful. Liquor, cash, dog food, 4 stops one day. That's good. That's good. Steve says, and cat food, laugh out loud, same place. Steve Gonzo, I heard a North Carolina guy got arrested in a plot to kill Biden too. Steve said, yep, the armed child porn guy. Oh, great. Kay says, Ali Velshi will be in Asheville, North Carolina tomorrow morning on his show. Kay says, Asheville is a very progressive part of North Carolina, though. Yes, it's an art colony and a retirement place for rich people, isn't it? Steve Gonzo said, the mask holes, the hashtag mask holes are disrupting poll stations, circling in their pickups, blaring horns. Oh, my God. Kay says, we haven't had those problems here in Virginia yet. Kay says, voting needs federal rules to make it fair and easier to vote in the U.S. It does need some federal rules, and it needs to make it a federal crime for people to do anything to disrupt the process of voting. We really need to sick the FBI on these guys. Deborah says, Joe, I have to say I'm not on board with Joe Biden, so I have to bow out. We'll see how things shake out over the election. I can't with Joe. I'm sorry. That's okay, Deborah. No problem, Deborah. We don't give people any bad feelings for making a choice of conscience. Everybody has to make up their own minds about this. We don't hassle anybody, and we don't get unfriendly to anybody for disagreement either. And Kay says, I totally understand, Deborah. I'm just hoping to save my Social Security as it is my only income. Steve says, Ohio number 6 after such a promising rebound. Kay says, Ohio will go up more after Rump's super spreader in Circleville today too, Steve Gonzo. And what did Steve say? Stats are coming in on the super spreader rallies just as you'd expect. Kay says, I think Pence had one in Dayton too. How many people went to see Pence? Who goes to see Pence? Why would anybody go to see Pence? And Cora Emanuel says, I just finished watching the independent open presidential debate. Howie Hawkins sounded like he's learned a lot about MMT recently. It was wonderful to hear. Oh, that's great. That's great. I got to look at that. I assume it's on YouTube, Cora. Steve Gonzo says, Pence's top 8. One Marty Opts tests positive for COVID virus. Kay says, Socialist Pope, LOL. I think they thought Cardinal Montini was a communist at the time. I mean, they called him the Red Cardinal, for God's sakes. The Red Cardinal. He turned out to have a personality that was uncomfortably close, in my estimation, to Pope Pius XII, who was terrible. He was awful. I couldn't stand Cardinal Montini, Pope Paul VI, but not after Pope John, it's 23rd. I mean, John the 23rd was really a decent person, really a kind person. Steve says, Shark Tank's bootstrap bitch O'Leary agrees nothing will change with a feckless Biden in charge. So he doesn't care who wins. Well, he may be right, or he may be wrong. Cora says, yes, Joe, it's on YouTube. Thank you, Cora. I appreciate the link, and we'll take advantage of it. Okay, everybody. I think that's all for tonight. Okay, unless I get a blast of other comments. But if you have no more, I will say good night. I have a couple of other short takes cut that I'll be posting tomorrow. I posted one on YouTube today. Excuse me. My throat suddenly felt dry. There we go. Okay, I think that's it. So good night, all. I'll be back with short takes Sunday and Monday, and probably for part of Tuesday too. And my next live stream will be on Tuesday night. Okay, says thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. Stay safe. I have to echo that sentiment. I love you all, and you stay safe too. And if Deborah Wilson is still here, just remember, Deborah, you don't have to agree with anybody here. And you don't have to go for Joe Biden. You don't have to hope that Joe Biden wins. Okay? Everybody has a right to their choice in the voting booth or outside of it, for that matter. Good night, Cora. Thanks for coming. Nice to see you. And good night, everybody. Have a great Sunday.